the song Chest Crawl from the band Guantanamo Baywatch. It appears on their album Chest Crawl, and you can find out more about that band over at their website at GuantanamoBaywatch.com, or you can just follow the link in the show notes over at MonsterKidRadio.net. That's the homepage for this podcast, Monster Kid Radio, the podcast devoted to covering the classic and sometimes not so classic monster movies of yesteryear. You're going to hear that song in its entirety at the end of this episode, but that will be after part one of my discussion with returning guest Paul McComas. We're going to talk about another zombie movie. That's 2 weeks in a row we've done zombie movies here on Monster Kid Radio. See, back in the day, I used to do a zombie movie podcast, Mail Order Zombie. Did that for 5 years, and I never talked about I Walked with a Zombie on that show, but I did talk about it on a podcast. I talked about it back in 2010 on episode 96 of the B Movie Cast. There'll be a link to that in the show notes as well. That might have actually been my very first appearance on the B Movie Cast. It was a lot of fun to talk about that movie with Vince, and it was a lot of fun to talk about the movie again with Paul in this week's episodes of Monster Kid Radio. If I had reviewed this movie on Mail Order Zombie back in the day, I would have given it a rating of 5 headshots out of 5. This is a great film. This is one of Paul's favorites, and I think it's probably one of my favorite zombie movies of all time as well. I cannot wait to dive into what this movie is, and more importantly, what this movie means with Paul. And just so you know, this is going to get a little spoilery, but the movie's 70 years old. This is the 70th anniversary of this film, so if you haven't seen it by now, I think that's more on you than me or Paul. Now, Paul has been on the show before. You can find out about him over at his website, paulmccomas.com, or again, link in the show notes over at our website. He is the co-author of the book Fit for a Frankenstein, which takes place in the Universal Frankenstein world. It fills in the gap between two of the Frankenstein films from the Universal cycle, and it's a fun read. Published by Walkabout Publishing. You can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it as an ebook from Amazon or over at Smashwords, or you can buy it directly from his website. Again, that's paulmccomas.com, and he takes $1 off the retail price if you buy the book that way. So go check that out. He co-authored that with Greg Sturrett, and it's an award-winning book. Recently won an award. So really, Monster Kids, you got to have this in your collection. Let's get some of the business out of the way. You can always get a hold of me by email at monsterkidradio@gmail.com, or you can give me a call and leave us a voicemail at 503-479-5MKR. I do have some feedback in the hopper, so to speak, and if you want to add your voice to the feedback, well, drop me a line, because I am going to be doing a special feedback episode down the line. If you have any comments about anything that we've talked about on the show in the past, or just have a Monster Kid friendly type topic you want to rap about, well, you know how to get a hold of us. No excuses. Now, you found this show because you're either listening to it courtesy of your Stitcher app on your smartphone, you downloaded it from our website, or you subscribed to it over on iTunes. Well, for any new listeners who happen to listen to the show through iTunes, I'm going to ask you to go over there and review the show. Give us an honest rating. Here's the challenge. If we can get 50 reviews in the iTunes store, and honest reviews, I'm not just looking for a handout. If we can get 50 honest reviews about the show over in the iTunes store, I launch a new show, a new supplemental podcast as part of the Monster Kid Radio Network. That's the deal. It'll be a regular show. It'll be monthly. It'll be relevant to what we talk about here on Monster Kid Radio. It'll just be a little bit more focused on one particular topic. I'm not going to tell you what that is until we get at least 35 reviews in the iTunes store. So challenge number 1, 35 reviews. I'll tell you what the new show will be. 50 reviews, we produce and launch the show. We are active over on Facebook. You can find our group and our page. Real easy to join the group. I approve those requests pretty quickly, and of course we always appreciate as many likes as we can get on the page. You know, I've talked enough here. I want to go ahead and get into part 1 of our discussion about I Walked with a Zombie with Paul McComas right after this.
Do you enjoy movies like Carnival of Souls, The Mole People, Black Sunday, and The Tingler? Do you find yourself late at night reading magazines such as Film Max, Chiller Theater, or Monster Bash? Do you love vintage television programs like Sky King, Outer Limits, and The Time Tunnel? Do you find yourself surfing the net looking for the next monster movie festival or expo? Do you enjoy hearing anecdotes, cinematic details, and unusual insights into some of your favorite movies? If you answered yes to any of the above, you are encouraged to join your host, Vince Rotolo, as he examines some of the latest horror, sci-fi, and cult theatrical releases, new DVDs to add to your collection, and of course, the old classics, both good and bad. He even interviews people throughout B-Moviedom. So tune into B-Movie-Cast at bmoviecast.com.
70 years ago, saw the release of a film that has been called the best voodoo film of all time. It is produced by Val Lewton and is thick with all things that we associate with Val Lewton Productions. Deft use of shadow and light, more than passing character depth, wonderful stories, brisk, efficient storytelling. I'm talking about I Walked with a Zombie. And I've got returning guest Paul McComas on the show to talk about this film. He's actually somebody who's called this movie the best voodoo movie ever made in private correspondence, so of course I had to have him on to talk about this film. How's it going, Paul?
Oh, great, Derek, and it's a real pleasure to be back with you, and I'm excited to talk about one of my favorite movies, probably my second favorite movie after High Noon.
Wow.
One of my favorite fellow film buffs in the 70th anniversary year, as you pointed out. Yeah.
It was released in April of 1943, so this is an older film from the 40s, but I think it still holds up. It's a pretty short film, so you don't have to worry about getting too bogged down in what's going on. It's still, I think, a very relevant film in terms of its storytelling.
In so many ways, and it is short. It's only 69 minutes, but like all of the Lewton-Tourneur collaborations, a real study in less is more. And it's interesting. People tend to fall into one camp or the other. As I heard you introducing it, it struck me that you're mentioning the producer, and many people do see Lewton as the auteur of those RKO, low-budget, psycho-supernatural thrillers. And I admire Lewton, but I go first to Jacques Tourneur, the director, in at least the case of the three that he did with Lewton, which I would list in order of merit. I Walked with a Zombie, followed closely by Cat People, and then The Leopard Man in third. All fine films. I think I Walked with a Zombie is the masterpiece, and I think that those three, because of Jacques Tourneur's input as director, are head and shoulders above the other Val Lewton productions from that series. I like some of them. I like Isle of the Dead and Body Snatcher and some of the other ones. But when Lewton's vision was combined with Tourneur's, then I think you saw the best of the best. Oh, definitely. And those three films do stand out amongst all of them. I think Lewton's influence and impact on the films is undeniable, but there's something to be said for the fact that the three films that you mentioned are also my three favorite Lewton films. And Tourneur's ability as a director can't be discounted at all. I mean, he would also go on to do things like Curse of the Demon, which is a fantastic film. So away from and one of the best film and one of the best films noir of all time, Out of the Past, and an exceptional late Twilight Zone episode, fifth season Twilight Zone episode called Night Call. Mm-hmm. Lewton was hit or miss. Tourneur always, I think, hit. So yeah, and nowhere better than I Walked with a Zombie. Where to begin?
Well, how did Tourneur and Lewton get together? Do you know the story of how they started collaborating together?
I know less about how they started than kind of what the process was like once they did.
Okay.
And my understanding is that when Tourneur was working on those films, he was given a title, a sensationalist title, I Walked with a Zombie, which was a magazine article title, and The Cat People, The Leopard Man, and given some garish poster art. And then he would turn to one of his favorite writers, one or more of his favorite writers. In this case, Kurt Siodmak, who of course was an MVP screenwriter over at Universal, the auteur of the original Wolfman, just for starters. Kurt Siodmak and Ardell Ray. And would say to them, write me something smart that works with this title. And they would bring back a smart horror script, and the story goes that Tourneur would then page through it, and every time he saw a monster, he'd cross it out, and he'd say, now we film. That's how you get, these amazingly ambiguous films, particularly for that era, a very literalist kind of era, wartime to boot. But these movies that are Rorschach tests in a way, or like the blind men with the elephant. It's a tree, it's a spear, it's a snake. It depends on your point of view. And so you can watch I Walked with the Zombie and be utterly convinced that there is a supernatural element, and that zombies, Carrefour and Jessica Holland, are both the Walking Dead. Or you can watch the same movie and come out of it thinking it's a result of the guilt surrounding the adultery and the love triangle that has plagued the Holland and Rand families. Or you can come out of it saying, actually, it's all about the legacy of slavery and zombification as a metaphor for the white family that's walking around carrying their family's sins, both public and private, around with them and unable to escape those. And I mean, I can say that I've had those three reactions and others to this movie depending on what mood I was in when I watched it on a certain day. I've probably seen the movie 20 times, and it always plays out a little bit differently for me depending on what I'm looking for and kind of where I'm at personally. So that's an incredible accomplishment for a very low-budget movie made 70 years ago.
My background is with zombie movies. Before I launched Monster Kid Radio, I did 5 years of a zombie podcast. Yeah. And when I came to this film originally, it was because it was a classic zombie movie, but there's also so much more going on here. I'm sure it's an iconic classic zombie film, probably one of the most important of the pre-Romero zombie cycle. I mean, I put it right up there with White Zombie in terms of its importance in that particular subgenre.
I'd say it's even more important.
Really?
And such a better movie on many levels, and not kind of bogged down in the stereotypes that White Zombie is. I think it's way ahead of its time in a lot of ways. But, I mean, who's the zombie in this movie? One thing I do when I teach this film in a film class is I count the zombies. We've got two literal zombies, Carrefour, played by Darby Jones, who I see as a walking kind of emblem of the legacy of slavery. He's no bodybuilder. He looks starved. He looks like the embodiment of the visitation of torture and torment upon the black race by the white race. And he's voiceless and mute, and just, a walking reminder of what this island, St. Sebastian, a.k.a. Haiti, is all about. And then Jessica Holland, the white woman zombie. They're the two literal zombies who may or may not be the Walking Dead, but certainly appear to be. Beyond that, there are moments of this movie, particularly towards the end, where Wesley Rand, the brother of Paul Holland, the lover of Jessica Holland, who has had an affair with his brother's wife, he's acting very much like a zombie when he, spoiler alert, kills his lover at the end.
Sure.
And what does he use to kill her? One of the arrows in Team Misery, one of the arrows in the slave ship figurehead. He pulls it out. And, how fitting, given this take on the movie, if you buy this take, which I totally do, that it is about the legacy of slavery. Paul Holland also seems haunted, enchanted, suspended, trapped, zombie-like at certain times. Mrs. Rand, the mother of both Paul and Wesley, when she's confessing to her role in the way things have played out, she delivers her speech in a monotone. Her eyes are open and blank. So there are multiple zombies in this movie depending upon how you want to define zombie. And people who are suspended between one life and another, one reality and another, just the way that objects are suspended in that amazing wordless scene just after the middle of the picture where the actual walk with the zombie occurs. There's so much going on at so many levels. It is a wonderful zombie movie, but it's my favorite zombie movie. It's my favorite voodoo movie. It's my second favorite movie of all time.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I like about some of these classic, quote-unquote, zombie films is there is so much going on. You see all these different themes with things like White Zombie and I Walk with a Zombie, loss of identity, the supplantation of one culture over another, all these things happening just beneath the surface that if you're looking for it, you can find it and enjoy it. But even if you don't look for that, you're still going to find something in the film to really latch onto. And the filmmaking of this is just top-notch. I just watched it for the first time, I think, in about a year or so this afternoon, getting ready for our chat.
Yeah.
While it has been a while for me, I still remember all the iconic scenes, Darby Jones in the field and, the Jessica walking around. And, man, there are so many things about this movie to latch onto.
The staircase in the tower. Yeah, the staircase, which if you look at it, it goes from up on the left side of frame to down on the right side of frame, almost like a graph or a chart that's showing you a decline. It's never seen from the other angle, and so the staircase appearing early and prominently in the film, and so strikingly just kind of tells you the direction that things have been going and that the way that things are going are going to go over the course of this narrative. I've got something queued up here. We did this on the Chaney interview with a scene from Son of Dracula, and it's a very quick dialogue scene. And I just want to play this for the sake of people out there who might say this movie has nothing to do with race, this movie has nothing to do with the legacy of slavery. This is 4.5 minutes into the movie, and it's a very short dialogue scene where the black carriage driver is taking our heroine, Betsy Connell, to Fort Holland, and explains a little bit of the history. So I'll play it, and then probably you'll substitute good audio for it. But here it comes.
The Hollands was the most old family, miss. They brought the colored folks to the island. The colored folks in T. Misery.
T. Misery? What's that?
A man, miss. An old man who lives in the garden at Fort Holland, with arrows stuck in him and a sorrowful, weeping look on his black face.
Alive?
No, Mitch. He's just the same as he was in the beginning, on the front side of an enormous boat.
You mean a figurehead?
If you say, miss. And the enormous boat brought the long-ago fathers and the long-ago mothers of us all chained to the bottom of the boat.
They brought you to a beautiful place, didn't they?
If you say, miss. If you say.
If you say, miss. If you say.
I was going to bring that up, and I'm glad you chose that clip, because that just speaks volumes.
Doesn't it? She's our heroine, and she is a moral person throughout this movie. But even she is blind, because she is a white woman of privilege from Canada, a career woman. That, by the way, is kind of rare to have a movie in 1943 whose point of view character and protagonist is a career woman. But she's blissfully unaware of the meaning of what this guy is saying to her. Mm-hmm. And T. Misery, to me, is a character in the narrative that's going to play out. He's the last character shown at the end of the movie. The fade out is over T. Misery with the arrows still stuck in him, except for the one that Wesley uses to kill his lover Jessica. And we first see T. Misery during some voiceover from Betsy Connell, and it's at the moment where she says the word hate, actually.
Oh.
That's where Tourneur cuts to a shot of the slave ship figurehead. It's on the word hate. So, it's there. People can see it or not, but I'm not making this stuff up.
No, not at all. No, like I said, I'm glad you picked that clip, because that sequence, I think, embodies the entire thing that we were just talking about. If you say, miss, I mean, it's such a... Is gut punch too cliche to say here? Because it is a punch in the gut when you really realize what's happening here. Yeah,
they brought you to a beautiful place, didn't they? Yeah, it's chained to the bottom of the boat. And, I could take this further. That scene where Betsy wakes up and Alma the maid serves her the brioche. Well, first of all, you've got two employees of the Holland family there. They should be roughly equal in their status, but they're not because of race. And so Alma the black maid is serving the white servant, our heroine Betsy, and serves her this, she says, I call it a puff-up, but Miss Jessica always said brioche, and as soon as Betsy puts her knife in it, it collapses. And if that's not the collapse of colonialism, European colonialism, I don't know what is. They play it for laughs. But that brioche is associated with Jessica, the pampered rich white woman, and it's a French dish. And, like Haiti, the fictional Saint Sebastian has French elements to it and some French words that are being used, including in the song that the balladeer delivers. And he's wonderful, isn't he? Sir Lancelot.
He's great. No, and that song... The song was written for the film, obviously, but it so encapsulates everything that's going on here. Once you hear the song, you know the story. You know what's going down. Yeah. And it's performed so well.
And in the early 60s, a version of that song became a hit in England with the different verses but the same chorus. So it had a life beyond the movie. It had an afterlife, appropriately. And I love the fact that Sir Lancelot's character, the balladeer, he acts so mortified about having performed the song by daylight. But then when night comes and Wesley's passed out from drinking and Betsy's there basically alone, the balladeer sees his opportunity to tell the truth, to bear witness about what's happened, and he comes out of the darkness. As so many characters in this movie emerge from the darkness, Tourneur does such a great job, not just with lighting, but with depth of field, too. Like that moment after they've tried the insulin shock therapy, and we have a touching scene between Betsy and Paul, and then when Betsy leaves, Wes emerges from the darkness, and he's been listening the whole time.
Yeah.
The way Tourneur uses the shadows of blinds to suggest that these characters are imprisoned, the shadows of blinds that suddenly look like prison bars across the characters.
Yeah.
Characters emerging from the darkness, kind of just sort of almost ghost-like, wandering into and out of each other's lives and haunting each other. The way that multiple times when Betsy and Paul, who are falling in love, are having a conversation, and the music is romantic, but then the romantic music gets drowned out by the jungle drums. It's this push and pull between the European and the African, between the subjugated and the subjugators, and the drums win every time. They get rid of that romantic music and replace it. They supplant it. And sure enough, who wins at the end of this movie? It's not the Hollands, the Rands. It's not the white family that's owned the sugar mill for generations. You can't imagine any of those characters remaining on St. Sebastian at the end of this movie. I think it's a foregone conclusion that they're all going to leave now.
Yeah.
And St. Sebastian is Haiti. So it's stand-in for Haiti. And what was Haiti? It was a port between coastal Africa and the so-called New World. Well, new to the people who settled it, not new to the people who'd been living there already, the indigenous people. But Haiti was a huge part of the slave trade. It was where slaves were brought in between being kidnapped from Africa and being sold in the so-called New World. And so it itself is in limbo. Haiti's in limbo. St. Sebastian is in limbo between these two worlds. And so what better place for voodoo to really take hold? Voodoo was extremely empowering for the people stolen from Africa and treated as product, because it was the one area where the slave had power and control. You can sell me as property, but I have this belief system that no one can take away. And so slaves would often sneak off when they could into private places at night and hold these rituals, ceremonies, religious ceremonies, and feel some power at a time when they've been rendered all but powerless by being treated as someone else's property. The ceremony in this movie is still, 70 years later, I haven't seen a voodoo movie that is more authentic to the way I understand voodoo ceremonies to actually operate. And you'll notice that voodoo is never really presented in this movie as a force of evil.
No, not at all. Which is kind of refreshing, actually, because
amazingly so, yeah.
So many times.
Right. I mean, like any religion, there's good and evil within voodoo, but most evil doing in voodoo is done through something called the Secte Rouge or the Red Sect, and it's a perversion of voodoo. But what we see in this movie is voodoo that is bringing a community together, voodoo that is trying to keep the dead among the dead and the living among the living. The reason Carrefour is trying to bring Jessica back to the home fort is because she doesn't belong at Fort Howland anymore. She is the walking dead. She's out of place among the living people. So she's a curse living among them. And it's just so sophisticated. The Tourneur's understanding, possibly aided by the fact that he was a Frenchman, he's able maybe to see the so-called New World and the slave trade in a slightly different and more evolved way than maybe an American director in the 1940s would have been able to do. This movie is way ahead of its time on race.
Definitely, and there are still elements in it that are timeless now. It's got so much going on here. The movie actually began, like you said, with the title. My understanding is that the title came from this article by Inez Wallace. Right. Have you read the original article? Are you familiar with it at all?
I haven't. That's what you told me about it is all I know. That's what I've seen too, and it's credited, based on a story by. But as I understand it, the narrative of I Walked with a Zombie, the movie, bears virtually no resemblance whatsoever to what I've heard is described as a fairly exploitative and inaccurate article. Yeah. Theodmac and Ardell Ray did their research, I think, because even something far more recent, like in the 80s when The Serpent of the Rainbow came out, and that was based on a nonfiction book about voodoo, an anthropological book. But it's pretty exploitative, and it definitely skews towards voodoo as evil force, which is just so reductive and so much less interesting than the truth about voodoo. It's a pretty psycho-spiritually sophisticated religion that allows, through possession, whether it's literal or figurative, disempowered people to feel empowered, the spirit world to speak and communicate through the living, and cathartic dancing, cathartic possession. I think that the major religions of the world could probably learn a thing or two about the therapeutic aspects of voodoo.
Well, my understanding, at least, I read an essay by Brian Sen. It appears in the book Drums of Terror, Voodoo in the Cinema.
Right.
The way he tells it, the article was used for the title pretty much, and that's it. Siodmak came in, wrote a screenplay that was very similar to White Zombie that ended up getting reworked by Ardell Ray, which is what we've got here. Now, of course, this has all been kind of directed by Lewton, who said, well, make it like Jane Eyre.
Right.
And that's
right.
Yeah.
That's right. It's Jane Eyre in the West Indies. Yeah.
So you've got all this going on, this love triangle happening between, you said, Rand and Holland, and then Betsy Connell, this career woman, this single woman, this Canadian nurse who is looking for work and ends up going from this cold, snowy environment, somewhere in Canada, I assume.
Right. Ottawa, yeah. Yeah,
down to the islands, and the potential employer, the person doing the interviewing, actually talks about how wonderful it will be. You'll be sitting underneath a palm tree and drinking drinks. You don't have to worry about any of this cold, oppressive weather anymore.
Mm-hmm. And instead she finds a different kind of oppression.
Well, that's true.
Yeah. Poor thing. I mean, the first time we see Betsy, she's laughing because her employer has asked her to believe in witchcraft. And then we cut to Betsy for the first time, and we see her laughing. Laughter and tears, they don't necessarily mean what you think they're going to mean. On St. Sebastian, people weep when a baby is born. That's also part of the legacy of slavery. Mm-hmm. It's a holdover. It's still a servant class. They may not be slaves, but they're still a servant class. And Alma, the house servant, still weeps when her sister has a baby. They celebrate at death. There are a lot of inversions. The protagonist and heroine is dressed in black, and the zombie woman, Mrs. Jessica Holland, is dressed in white. Yeah. And that suggests that maybe we need to open our minds, particularly if we're living in 1943, need to open our minds to, what black and white mean in this movie. 2 voodoo patches are put on Betsy and Jessica before they go on their walk by Alma. A white patch is put on Betsy and a black patch is put on Jessica. And the white patch comes off in the brush. Mm-hmm. The white patch does not survive the walk, but the black patch does. That seems symbolic and metaphoric, too. Mm-hmm.
Now, when Betsy first meets Paul Holland, it's not in St. Sebastian. It's actually on the boat ride over. Yep. They're on the ship together, and there's a little bit of narration at the very beginning of the movie and a few spots throughout, and she's doing this narration about the beautiful stars.
Her voiceover.
Yeah.
Right.
And so there's some interaction here, and right off the bat, Holland's being painted as, he's not painted as a sympathetic guy.
No. And yet she falls in love with him. That's part of that kind of Gothic tradition. It's sort of like Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice. Paul is the guy who it would be impossible to love, and that's why she falls in love with him. Right. I'm glad you mentioned the voiceover because it only lasts for the first 30 out of 70 minutes. Mm-hmm. It happens fairly often during the first half hour of the movie, and it's at that moment where the voiceover is confessing Betsy's love for Paul that she finds herself falling in love with him, and she's standing looking out at the sea, which is a nice sort of foreshadow of how and where things are going to end in this movie. But she confesses her love, and then we have no more voiceover from her, which is an interesting choice to suggest, I think, that when you're in love, you no longer have that kind of control that the voiceover suggests, the narrative control. All bets are off once you're in love. It's a kind of hex. It's a kind of spell. And she's going to be drawn deeper and deeper in. I often like to focus on what happens at the dead center of a movie. Okay. My film studies students will always tell you that I'll always mention what happens at the absolute middle of a movie. And here it's Alma saying to Betsy, there are other doctors, there are better doctors, in reference to Damballa and Legba. and the voodoo gods. And that's where the die is cast, because Betsy hears that, she takes it to heart, she takes Jessica on the walk, and then things start to unravel pretty darn quickly.
I love the moment where they are talking about these other doctors, there's other things that can be done, and how these other entities have cured people, and she says, well, That's nonsense. Well, he can cure nonsense too. And it's, it's this witty kind of, there's a witticism, or I don't know if that's quite the right word, but there's a wit to the dialogue here as well that propels the story forward. I mean, it's so short that there's so much going on. It feels like a full meal, even though it just runs over an hour.
Yeah, it needs to be seen repeatedly. But yeah, it is very clever dialogue. I love the fact that fairly early in the movie, after we've had the first appearance of Jessica in the tower, and by the way, check it out, she's wearing some kind of makeup around her eyes to make her look a little bit spookier, but only in the kind of, not after Paul and Alma and the other guy show up. So it's very subjective. You see her as a monster when the lights are out, but then when the lights come on and help arrives, then you see that she's just this haunted and crazed woman. But, then the two servants are talking, Alma and the man, and he tells her, would you stop crying like that because you upset Miss Connell? And Alma says, yeah, well, she didn't soothe me any with walking around the tower at all hours, which is a great line, and shows that actually this is my island. Alma seems to be saying, this is my island, this is our island, these are our ways, and don't tell me that I should be upsetting the latest white woman who showed up for me to serve brioche to.
I did like Alma quite a bit as a character. She struck me as the kind of person who probably more than once let her mouth get her into trouble. She's got a little spunk to her. Yeah.
Teresa Harris is the actress, and she's terrific. Yeah, it's a great cast. By the way, Mrs. Rand, Edith Barrett, did you know that Edith Barrett was only 36 when she played the mother of Paul and Wesley, who are played by actors her own age? She's wearing old age makeup. And B, she was Mrs. Vincent Price.
Yeah, I should know that.
Well, you do now.
I do now. Thank you.
You probably did before. We can't keep all the trivia in our heads all the time. But yeah, Edith Barrett was Mrs. Vincent Price at the time, and she was only 36, made up to look older. But she's got those great, dark, soulful brown eyes. And you see her world come apart. I mean, she's fairly offensive at a couple of times when she talks about how primitive these people are and how she was afraid for her life. And so she decided to take control by pretending to become a voodooist. And guess what happened? In for a penny, in for a pound, pretty soon she's believing with every fiber of herself. And she's complicit. We have here a love triangle between Paul, Wesley, and Jessica, but then the mother of Paul and Wesley is also a part of what goes wrong. They all share responsibility. They all share blame. But to me, the whole kind of romantic intrigue and adultery plot is just sort of a stand-in and a metaphor for much more serious sins committed by the Holland family since its arrival steering the slave ship. And Betsy, one nice surprise about the movie's full of surprises, and one is that I remember the first time I saw it assuming that there was going to be a love triangle, but it was going to be between Betsy and the two brothers.
Right.
And it's not at all. Wes has no interest in her beyond some friendly banter and says to his brother outright, you're different from me because I'm not in love with another woman. In other words, I don't have mixed feelings about whether I really want Jessica to return to her senses. Wesley does want her to return to her senses because he's in love with his brother's wife, Jessica, right. Whereas Paul is falling in love with Betsy. So, yeah, the love triangle here is not where you think it's going to be. It's in the past rather than in the present.
Right.
And it's got this shadow over it, the shadow of the madness and possible zombification of Jessica Holland.
Yeah, it's definitely not your traditional love triangle. Maybe a weird love rectangle thing. I don't know. It's just, it doesn't really have a form. It's,
yeah.
But it is kind of all over the place. And you're right. The mother's involvement and everything is just like I remember the first time when I watched it and that revelation came out.
Yeah.
Like that really kind of blew my mind a little bit too. But then of course, when you start thinking about it and see the things that she's been doing ever since she was introduced, all the things that she said, of course it makes sense. She's been involved in a much darker level than we probably all assume watching the movie for the first time.
She's been trying to use voodoo, just as her family and the Holland family have been trying to use the black people on this island. And what happens is they end up ultimately paying for their crimes. They end up being used because they're dealing with powers far more significant than they are aware. They think it's just crazy superstition. But several characters at different points say, like Paul says to Wesley, or Wesley to Paul, we believed that when we were boys, but we don't believe that anymore.
Right.
Well, actually, growing up and reaching maturity might mean being more open to what you've discarded and what you've just assumed to be primitivist claptrap.
Being a little bit more open
to other ways.
And aware of other things and that sort of thing. And her posing, Mrs. Rand posing as something that she's clearly not,
right.
During the ceremony and all that, it's offensive. I mean, she has co-opted a religion practically here, and it goes back to the subjugation of another people, lots of it, all of that is just laid bare here.
She does it with best intentions.
Sure.
That's often the case.
Yeah.
Major crimes.
Exactly.
Yeah, and she gets pulled into it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and she thinks she's in control, but she's being controlled.
I love her performance in this. I think the cast, we mentioned earlier, the cast is solid all the way through.
Very.
I think Frances D is amazing as a leading lady in this film. She wasn't
very strong. Yeah.
She wasn't the original choice. I mean, she kind of came in late. There's somebody else lined up, wasn't there?
Yeah, I think so. Probably someone more traditional. She's rather diminutive, and in a way, I suppose it might have made more sense to cast a blonde in the role. But Jessica Holland is sort of the white woman, and then Frances D is the outsider. Mm-hmm. So, but I love the brothers too, Tom Conway and James Ellison. Tom Conway is such a terrific British-trained actor, and often he had terrible roles in terrible movies like Voodoo Woman later. If you've ever seen that, it's one where, he's walking around with a headdress of feathers most of the time, and it's been suggested by some people that probably he's insisted on wearing that as much as possible as a way of covering as much of his face as he could throughout the movie. But every now and then he got a role that was worthy of his talents, and I think Paul Holland is his best role. I think it's his masterpiece, and his chemistry is excellent with Frances D. It's also excellent with James Ellison as his half-brother.
Yeah, I totally bought the relationship of brothers here, or stepbrothers, technically.
Half-brothers.
Yeah,
the same mother and different fathers,
And they do explain why one has an American accent, one has a British accent. So
that's right, because Wesley was educated in America.
Right. So
and
Jay's a Wolfman, maybe,
Right, exactly. Right. Mrs. Rand, she was married to Paul's father. She was a Holland. That's the family that established the slave industry in St. Sebastian. And then when Paul's father died, she married a missionary whose last name was Rand, and he died too. And so we see already in the backstory that there's some kind of, curse or punishment going on, even if it's not recognized as such. Mrs. Rand has lost 2 husbands on this island. Mm-hmm. And her elder son, Paul, has lost his wife. So, loss is something that they've been inflicting on the people brought over from coastal Africa, and now loss is karmically coming back around. The roosters or the hens are coming home to roost. Mm-hmm.
What was the first thing that went through your mind the first time you saw Darby Jones in this movie?
Oh, well, when you get the close-ups, you realize that those eyes are fake. I think it's a neat effect. The unblinking eye. I mean, what is that saying? Yeah. He's bearing mute witness to everything that's happened on this island, and he's the instrument of the voodoo community. They send him out to bring Jessica back. He's incredible, so tall, so thin. And by the way, the first shot in the movie, which has nothing to do with anything in the timeline that follows, is a long shot of Darby Jones's Carrefour and Betsy Connell walking on the beach side by side while we hear the voiceover saying, "I walked with the zombie," and then she giggles and she says, "I know it sounds funny." and what an interesting shot to begin this movie with. It almost like an implicit message of integration and mutual understanding. Because there's certainly no point in the movie where Betsy Connell takes a walk with Carrefour on the beach during the day.
No.
So it's an impressionistic shot that Tourneur starts with. And if we start with that shot and our bookend is a close-up of T. Misery, then, yeah, more and more this does become a movie about race and about trying to understand across the racial divide.
I love the reveal of Carrefour when we first see him.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously the eyes are, he's an iconic image. And when you think about the zombies in this movie, whether it's a zombie film technically or not, you think of Darby Jones. And when you first see him with the splash of light from the flashlight at his feet, and then you pan up to him.
The quick tilt up to show his face in the flashlight beam. And it takes Betsy's breath away. She gasps. And I think the audience gasps too. And what's wonderful is that he doesn't attack. He's not a monster. The monster is slavery. He's the victim. He's the emblem of that victimization. And he's the guide at the crossroads, and he allows them passage. Then he comes back to reclaim the dead for the dead. He certainly never kills anyone. It's Wesley, not Carrefour, that kills Jessica. And then Carrefour brings her back. That's 1943, and think of how it's turning on its head the racial stereotypes. Think of Birth of a Nation and all the other crap out there that was suggesting that white women had to fear for their lives, the lusty black buck, And yet Tourneur puts Jessica in Carrefour's arms at the end and has Carrefour bring her back to Fort Howland, almost as if to say, you caused this, not me.
Right.
I will deliver her back to you now, but you're responsible. It had nothing to do with black lust or so-called primitivism. The wages of this sin are your own. I'm reading between the lines, and I'm reading a lot between the lines. But I don't think that I'm getting carried away here because I've seen the movie 20 times and read about it and thought about it. And if people disagree with me, they can say whatever you say, just like the carriage driver says to Betsy Connell, whatever you say, miss, whatever you say.
Paul loves a good voodoo movie. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in part 2 of this week's episodes of Monster Kid Radio. That'll be coming out in 2 days. We're going to talk about voodoo films, voodoo in cinema. He's even going to mention a movie from the 70s that has zombies in it that I really like as well. So it'll be a fun time, and I invite you to join us back here at monsterkidradio.net in a couple of days for episode number 49. Big thanks to Paul for joining us on Monster Kid Radio this week. Again, you can find him at paulmccomas.com, find out about all of his books, find out about what he's got going on. And if you happen to pick up a book from him, tell him Monster Kid Radio sent you. Monster Kid Radio is a registered service mark of Monster Kid Radio, LLC. All original content of Monster Kid Radio by Monster Kid Radio, LLC is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivations, 3.0, Unported license. Of course, that does not apply to the song Chest Crawl. That belongs to the band Guantanamo Baywatch. It appears in this episode of Monster Kid Radio. With their permission, you can find it on their album Chest Crawl. Talk to you in a couple of days.